So far, I've had the opportunity to interview two people about their journaling practices, and this is the second one that I'm making available, and I'm so excited about it. I really had the great opportunity to talk with Kim LeVere about some of her journaling practices and how she used a journal in her travels for decision making, for processing emotions, and as a mindfulness practice. She's developed something that she calls the Five Senses Project, where she uses journaling prompts to describe all of the sensations she's receiving through her 5 different senses, and it's really an amazing tool. And in this interview, you get to listen to some of the stuff that she's written down using this practice and some of the ways that she's used journaling to help figure out her direction in life. As she says in this interview, she wants to share a little bit about what it's like being in the middle of the process instead of what we often get in our society is these accounts of people who have gone through something difficult and have come out the other side. And so she's talking about what it's like being in the middle, and I think that's something that a lot of people can use. This is a longer interview, so feel free to listen to it on your phone as you're driving. I will have a little bit of a slideshow with some images, but the main content of this is going to be the audio interview. So I really hope that you get something out of this. I greatly enjoyed the conversation. Let me know in the comments below what you learned and what you liked best, what questions you have, and what you would like to see in the future as I do more interviews such as this with people who are using journals in inspiring ways. All right, enjoy. First, it would be interesting to ask you about your upbringing, your parents, and how the early years in your family affected how you see the world.
Well, I grew up in Los Angeles. I grew up in a suburban neighborhood. And yeah, it's really interesting. I've never been asked that question before, so it's kind of catching me off guard. I guess I saw the world through my parents' eyes in a very rigid way. My grandfather was a Holocaust survivor, and so I think there was a lot of survival tactics that were instilled in my parents. And so I think there was a bit of rigidity in our upbringing in how we were supposed to show up in the world. There was a lot of pressure to be quote unquote successful and to really, make a lot of money and have security. I think the value of security was really strong in my family because we didn't have that in our last generation.
Yeah.
So I think that really influenced my upbringing a lot. So there's unfortunately, a lot of fear and desire for security that led them to kind of push me in this direction of excellence in academics and athletics.
Yeah.
And I think that definitely formulated the way I saw the world of what was good, quote unquote good, and what was successful.
So it sounds like achievement was an important takeaway for you, or your desire to achieve.
Yeah, I think achievement was really important. In a very that very stereotypical kind of way that you hear about, your family wanting you to be like a doctor or a lawyer or have a business. It felt really rigid for me personally, because I think growing up, I always felt different than my parents. And maybe that's because I was privileged that I wasn't growing up with parents that had survived the Holocaust and had instilled that in me. So I feel like I had a little bit more freedom than they did.
Yeah.
But at the same time, I still felt like I was being kind of shoved through this rigid perspective of what my life should look like.
Yeah.
And that was very confining for me up until my early 30s, when I decided to leave that kind of quote unquote successful life in search of something more fulfilling.
Yeah. Wow, thanks for sharing that. And so
at what point did you, so in my mind, achievement and a focus on achievement sometimes feels that it's in sort of the opposite direction from a focus on experience. And it, from what I'm imagining about your, and the very little that I know so far about your five senses journal, that's what you call it, right?
Yeah, I kind of call it the Five Senses Project.
The Five Senses Project.
Yeah.
So this might just be how I'm interpreting it from the name alone, but that feels like it's very experiential and all about experience. And does that sound right? Is that different from a focus on achievement, or do you think that in your family there was both?
Well, the first thing that came to mind when you said that was like, when the focus is on achievement, there's less of a focus on listening to your gut. And to me, that means like connecting with the senses and really listening to what they're telling you, and almost pushing through the sensory intakes that you're receiving.
Right.
And just kind of bypass that and ignore it. And I think when I started journaling this way, it kind of helped me ground and reconnect, and gather more information and almost like shift perspectives by, seeing the world through all the senses and giving that space and that time to gather more information before I made that decision, like the stimulus response.
Yeah, so, that's interesting. I think somehow in my mind I was imagining or predicting that there would be something that felt inherent in you that directed you towards this sort of experiential or focus on sensory. But it sounds to me, and correct me if I'm wrong, that you're almost saying that the journal has allowed you to get to that, but that it hasn't necessarily been something natural feeling, like that it's been almost of a like work to get to a point where you could experience that and not be, and get to that intuition. And
I think when you grow up with like a very rigid definition of what like success and fulfillment is, like I said, you can kind of turn off your senses and almost be on autopilot.
Yeah.
And when I went traveling after I quit my corporate job I went traveling alone for 10 months. I had no idea where I was going.
Whoa.
Yeah, I just needed to have like no plan for once. Because my whole life was so structured that my only desire in traveling, aside from like satiating that appetite of travel that I had, was to just have no plan. And so I booked a one-way ticket to Copenhagen, and I had no like schedule of where I was going to be, and I just had ideas of where I thought I would go. So it was almost this like journey of unlearning everything, all of that upbringing, and then relearning what made me tick and what made me feel fulfilled and happy and thriving. And I can't separate anymore like that experience with how important it was for me to access all of the senses, to start relearning what it even felt like to listen to my gut, I remember I was in Thailand. And I'm like a firm believer that, we have a lot of words in the English language, but there are just sometimes there are emotions that we're feeling. Yeah. And there are no words to certain emotions that we are uniquely feeling at any given time. And I remember I was in Thailand and I was just feeling really funky and like wanting to leave. And again, learning what it even felt like to listen to my gut and have a conversation with it. Yeah. And the first thing that came to mind was like, I had this idea that I was having sticky feet. So I coined this term for me of sticky feet as like a situation where I felt like I didn't know where I wanted to go, but I sure as heck didn't want to like stay where I was. Yeah. And I had this feeling of like my feet were in like sand, but the sand was mixed with honey and I like couldn't get my feet out. And I don't know if that's synesthetic or it's just, it helped me to really embody certain perspectives and really embody how I was feeling so that I could actually fully understand the perspective that I was currently sitting in, before I could move out.
Yeah.
And even like in that moment, like in between making a decision, I was learning to accept like how my processes were, that
Yeah.
like certain decisions weren't so easy. And so then I started thinking, oh, this is like swimming in a pool of indecision. And I could almost like see metaphorically like myself just kind of wading in this indecision pool. And I don't know, embodying and using metaphors helped me understand how I was feeling so much, especially growing up in like this autopilot, rigid kind of structure.
Yeah. So were you journaling during that trip? Mm-hmm. Interesting. And when you coined those terms, were you writing, or did you just pop into your head while you're walking around in Thailand?
It mostly came to me through writing.
Uh-huh. Interesting.
And also working with a coach.
Uh-huh.
I was studying coactive coaching while I was traveling, just to kind of understand the feelings that I was going through better. And then I hired a coach. And so through the coaching work that now I do and that she was doing, you really use metaphors a lot to help people embody perspectives. And so it just kind of helped, like turned on a new filter for me, or a new way of looking at things, where instead of feeling frustrated with the word that I was looking for, I would just come up with, like, invent a phrase or something to help me describe how I was feeling.
Wow.
And it was like really liberating, because I'm like, well, I'm not angry and I'm not irritated. I'm like, and then I would come up with a metaphor, and it felt like so soothing, like, oh yeah, that's what it is. But it was not invented, like the English language didn't provide it for me. So I think that was also a form of like getting rid of the rigidity of even our own language, that we confine ourselves and say we have to describe how we're feeling through these like words of happy, sad, and like, what if that's not how we're feeling?
Yeah, that's really interesting.
Yeah.
I'm gonna have to when I look back over this interview, I'm gonna have to steal that idea, because I like that that idea of creating metaphors to help like work through different things. And explain it, or understand it and put a form almost on it.
Well, it creates a reference.
Yeah.
So now I know, as a part of my process, is that like there are certain bigger decisions where the path doesn't light up clearly.
Yeah.
I get this feeling a lot now, where the metaphor is like I'm standing in a road and there's so many pathways that are available to me. And I almost like need it to light up, and I see it light up in like blue or purple or something. And before I make a decision, like all of the pathways just look the same color. And there's a moment where you have to just still gather information before you make a decision. And that used to be really unsettling to me and really frustrating.
Yeah.
And now I just say, oh no, you're at that moment right now where you're standing in the road, or you're in the indecision pool. And there's something that's really comforting about understanding your process and just saying, oh no, this is just the same thing that's happened to you before, and you'll get out of it. You just need to like wade in the water a little bit more, or like stand in that pathway before something lights up.
Yeah, so almost in naming it and connecting it to a place you've been before gives sort of familiarity and acceptance to being in that place.
Yeah.
Self-acceptance around it. Well, I've noticed that you've been mentioning decision-making a lot, so I'm very interested in decision-making, and some other people I've talked to about journaling have mentioned the importance of decision-making, or not the importance of decision-making, but have mentioned the difficulties or challenges around decision-making, people in our generation, and how for some of them they've sought journaling or different weird things like that to help them. So I've noticed you mentioning it multiple times already in this conversation, so could you say more about your process around decision making, or if that's something you use journaling, or what you find useful?
I notice that I journal a lot when I'm feeling indecisive. Because I think not everyone deserves to hear your story, especially when you're in the middle of kind of writing it. And as you're kind of writing that rough draft, that's how I think of journaling.
Yeah.
And it almost like helps me make decisions by writing out how I'm currently feeling and these like current perspectives or whatever it is that I'm going through. So I think journaling definitely has been a big piece of my decision-making process. That's interesting that you've found a lot of people talk through that in your interviews.
Well, not in my other interview, but in one person that I do want to interview. It's a friend of mine who came to a nature journaling thing, and she had never really been to a nature journaling. Most of the time, my nature journaling classes are older people, and I don't usually end up talking about other types of journaling during those trips. But this friend who came on that trip, she mentioned how she was trying to decide where to live and had a couple other big life questions. And I don't remember how, but I think, recommend journaling as a practice for helping to make decisions. And so I was just noticing it in some of the stuff that you've been talking about. You did say decisions a bunch of times, so that's why
Well, I think it's a natural topic that comes up when my whole trip was, the purpose of my whole trip was to have no plan. So in that, when there are no decisions that are made ahead of time, you're constantly faced with the fact that you haven't made decisions yet. And when I really sit with what I can't be with, that like indecisiveness is definitely one of them. I really don't like that feeling, or I didn't like that feeling when I was traveling, and I was learning a lot about the benefits of having some things planned out versus having this complete freedom to decide everything, like where you want to stay tomorrow, when your flight is. So I think I was really learning about my decision-making process through that whole trip and how much I want things to be planned out for me in the future at different times in my life, and how much I still want to leave, like how much freedom time I want to leave in that. Because you have to understand that my whole life before this was planned out. I worked in corporate retail for 10 years. I knew, the same subway that I was taking, and I knew when I was going into work. I knew, it was very structured, especially growing up and being a female athlete. Like I played soccer at least 3 to 4 times a week. So everything was very kind of making rigid marks with my hands right now. Like everything was very structured, and there wasn't a lot of room to just swim in that like freedom. And so when I completely flipped it on the other side, I learned, what the quote unquote negative sides are for not having anything planned out or anything structured. And what I realized is that sometimes I want that freedom, and other times, I might want the reliability of a little bit of structure.
Yeah. So let me ask you this before you delve into your journals, but did you journal before you made the decision to go on this trip?
Yes.
Okay, so how did you decide to go on the trip?
So my favorite quote is about this experience is from Brene Brown. She says that life isn't short on wake-up calls. We're just quick to hit the snooze button. And so I think I had numerous signs that I needed to change my lifestyle and just kind of take a leap of faith and jump into this like unknown world and figure out what it was exactly that I wanted to do and what my purpose was here. And I just kept ignoring the signs. A lot of them were physical, like I was getting frequent urinary tract infections. I started having like this cancerous growth on my foot that I had to like get chemo injections, localized injections from. So many things. I lost feeling in my right thumb. Like my body was giving me so many signs telling me this is not working for you. And, like I said before, my rigid upbringing made me keep feeling like I needed to just push through it.
Yeah.
Especially with my background in athletics, everything was like just push through the pain.
Yeah.
And then back in March of 2015, I got a phone call in my office that my ex-boyfriend passed away.
Yeah.
He was like my high school sweetheart. We had dated for almost 10 years.
Wow.
And I got a phone call from his sister that he had passed away from an overdose.
Wow.
And I think that was like the final like straw on the camel's back for me to just take a leap of faith. And I remember thinking, and I have it in my journal numerous times, it was almost like my mantra at the time, that the fear of nothing changing scared me more than the fear of everything changing.
Wow.
And so I know it's in my constitution to have this like desire to just change everything, and I wouldn't recommend that for everyone, but it was what I needed to do. I just needed to I basically quit my job of 10 years. I moved out of my apartment. I shipped everything home to Los Angeles to my parents' garage, and I booked a one-way ticket and I left. And I think it didn't all happen in a week.
Yeah.
I'd say it happened over like 3 or 4 months. And I was journaling a lot then, just kind of like grieving and going through the grieving process, but then just understanding what is the message here.
Yeah.
I think when you deal with losing someone, you have a few options. You can kind of take, this like woe is me approach, or the victim perspective, and ask yourself, why is this happening to me? Like, why did I deserve for this to happen? Why did I fall, this was the first person I like fell in love with. Like, how did this happen to me? And we all go through that phase. But then something shifted where I was like asking myself, well, how could I use or see his passing as a gift?
Right.
And there was just something that I felt like a wind at my back, just telling me, you need to go. Like, I could almost hear his voice. This feels like deeply personal, but I want to share. I could almost hear his voice saying, like, just go, like, just quit your job. Nobody's going to say anything because they know this happened to you. And I know that might sound a little weird, like to kind of use someone's passing as like your way to leave. But I felt like that was my permission. And so I used it, and it was really hard, but it was really, really liberating.
Wow, that's amazing. I had no idea there was going to be something like that. I mean, when you said 10 months of travel, I mean, that already, without a plan, that's already a pretty big shift.
Yeah. And I didn't even know how long I wanted to go for. I think I had it in my head that I wanted to be gone at least 6 months.
Yeah.
But the more I had spent time, there were like a few different chapters of my journey. And, each time I would check in and kind of ask myself, like, are you ready to go home? And it didn't feel right until May or June of 2016.
Wow. Maybe now would be a good time to look a little bit or talk a little bit about your process or some of the more like specifics around how you have been journaling. I noticed you have a computer and you have books, so that's one thing that would be interesting to know more about too.
Well, so when I was traveling, I knew I was planning to write a lot. I really felt like it was important to write about what was happening to me as I was going through it. And so I called the part in my journal, like there's a whole chapter called Through It, which is basically, this was all from my, actually starting here. Yeah, this is all from my travels from like when Mike died, which was 2 months before this. And I think I hadn't really,
Is this a blog?
No, it's on Evernote.
Okay.
So yeah, I felt like I kind of had to use a computer at that time.
Yeah,
Otherwise,
yeah.
I would just be like going through massive amounts of
Right.
journals, and I only traveled with a backpack, so
Yeah.
it was more of an economic
Yeah,
or like
yeah.
a space choice to write. But I appreciate handwriting a lot more because you have to be a lot more decisive with your word.
Interesting.
Especially now that we don't write so much anymore. Like, it's not familiar muscle memory. So, like, and I don't know, my thoughts just come so fast
Yeah.
that sometimes I have trouble just writing it down, handwriting it. So I've found sometimes, especially, I use journaling a lot for kind of word like vomiting or
Yeah.
venting, just to get things out. And sometimes I find that easier to like hit a keyboard.
Yeah.
And sometimes I'll just bang on the keyboard a bunch of times and just let like random letters come out.
Yeah.
So, but since we were talking about the Five Senses project specifically,
Yeah.
I wanted to bring this and then just kind of how it's manifested in my current journal. So my Five Senses project started when I was in Laos.
Yeah. The flip-flops or something.
Yeah. So, yeah, what a crazy journey. So the first chapter of my trip was in Europe. And I spent a lot of time, again, checking locations off of like this imaginary list that I had in my head of things that I should see. So I went back to London to visit friends and do some coaches trainings. Then I went to Germany because I always wanted to go to Oktoberfest. So I went alone to Munich to Oktoberfest. Anyone listening, don't ever do that. As a woman, it's a terrible idea. And I went to Spain to visit a friend, and as my bank account was dwindling, I realized like this is not the experience that I want to have. Like I went out to travel because I wanted to have true, meaningful, authentic experiences. And I really wanted to immerse myself in a place and live like a local and have that experience. And I sat there, I think I was in Madrid at the time, and asking myself, okay, well then if you could just go anywhere, you know, funny that I still had this rigid form of like, oh, I should go to Europe first and then like travel around. And then when I stripped that all away and said, well, what do you want to do if there was no judgment? And the first thing that popped into my mind was, I want to go work on a farm in France. And so that same day I went on the Woofing website, found like this really random profile, and read the description of what this man was looking for. We got on the phone. My French was terrible at the time because I hadn't spoken it in years.
But you still had some at least. Though,
Yeah,
right? So
enough to
that's
have
good.
a phone conversation with him. And I just took a BlaBlaCar. Do you know what BlaBlaCar is? It's an online website. It's a website where you can purchase ride sharing.
Yeah.
So someone can have a profile and say, hey, I'm going from Paris to Bordeaux, and I'm leaving on Saturday, and I have 3 seats in my car, and the price is 30 euros. It's the cheapest way to travel in Europe.
Wow, I don't think that was around when I was there.
Yeah,
but
it's
maybe
super
it was.
neat.
That's cool.
So I ended up taking a BlaBlaCar from Madrid to Bordeaux, France, over the border.
Yeah.
And yeah, that kind of was the turning point in my trip, because from then on, I only went places where I really felt like a pull towards.
Yeah.
And one of them was Laos. Actually, I didn't even know I was going to end up in Laos. I actually was in Thailand and having sticky feet, and was up in Chiang Mai, and I ended up getting 103-degree fever.
Oh my gosh.
And was stuck in a hostel sharing a room with like 4 other people.
Yeah.
Severely ill, and I just remember thinking, I want to get out of Thailand, but I don't know what my options are. And at the hostel I was staying at, I met a girl who ended up taking a bus to the between Thai and Lao border.
Yeah.
And then you could take a 2-day slow boat down the Mekong River and end in Luang Prabang. And I had never really heard much about Lao before. So I was just thinking, well, why not? I don't want to fly right now. I don't really want to do anything super strenuous. So, and it was really expensive to fly out of anywhere near Chiang Mai. So I decided to just go on this trip. And I won't get into all the details, but I ended up meeting this French guy. We like fell in love. We lived in a bamboo hut together for 6 weeks, and we did nothing but chill out. And it was the first time in my entire life that I gave myself permission to just chill. So we were in this tiny town called Mong Noi, only population like a few hundred people. There was a dirt road, a main road that just had like a few different businesses. I ended up wanting to learn how to cook there, so I walked into a kitchen of one of these like tiny little cafes and started cooking with this guy, and I ended up semi-working there and helping him start his business. I put him up on TripAdvisor. I rewrote his menus and like started serving and doing all the things. And we took a trip to the paper factory to make his menus, and I designed my own journal there. And I sat there with this journal, I don't know, for weeks. I didn't want to touch it because it was so beautiful.
Yeah, it's precious.
And it had like these beautiful like handmade, you know, like.
Is that mulberry or what kind of
I'm not sure what kind of paper this is.
I'm not that knowledgeable about paper, but I know that they do have mulberry in Southeast Asia for paper making.
Yeah, I'm
wow,
not
that's
sure.
really cool. So I see a lot of empty pages still.
Yeah, so for the longest time...
Bougainvillea, and I don't know what that is.
Yeah, bougainvillea was
this
like
is some
the
kind of
plant
mossy,
that...
it looks like, cool.
Yeah, bougainvillea has been throughout my whole childhood and upbringing, and like anywhere I traveled, it's always like the plant that speaks to me. So yeah, it just reminded me of home, so I used that as the cover.
So you made it while you were working at that place and living with this awesome French guy. And then you did start journaling in it at some point during that time, or how did you get over the precious factor?
I think I was really inspired by this idea of journaling using the 5 senses.
Okay.
And part of it was because it was like such a profound experience for me that taking photos and writing about it like didn't seem like enough.
Oh, interesting.
Photos to me really capture like your visual experience, and I feel like writing is focused a lot on story.
Yeah.
But you're missing a whole aspect of place that I really think you can connect to through the senses.
Yeah.
So.
And you wanted it what was the goal? You wanted it to look back on later?
I think I wanted to fully appreciate the experience as it was coming to an end. And it was something that I did with the French guy at the time.
He was journaling also?
He was journaling. We were both journaling a lot on our own.
Yeah.
And then we came together and kind of did this project of, okay, what do you remember about smell? And what are you remembering about taste and touch? And we actually did record us going through each sense, or just like memories that we remembered, and recorded it. I can play it for you if you want. So yeah, this was just more of like a fun project of like, okay, each page was one of the senses. And when I look back on it, I would have never remembered this in my journaling.
Yeah.
So, I don't know, I'll just kind of read.
And so I'm seeing a combination of words and images, and maybe some of these, if some of them are okay to use, I could post them with the audio from this. But yeah, it looks like a nice combination of words and images, which is cool, kind of like sketchnoting or something.
Yeah, this one's, the sound, something about the sound was really... really hit home for me. That's the flip-flop thing you were talking about, is I would have never remembered that nobody owned a pair of closed-toed shoes there. And keep in mind that this village was right at the base of the Namu River. And within within a few hundred yards, you were up in the jungle.
Yeah.
And so they would go into the jungle with
Yeah,
flip-flops.
yeah.
And all of the tourists are kind of with their trekking boots.
Yeah.
So it's something that I'll always remember because I wrote it and kind of just drew a picture. I don't think I had journaled about it before. And they were always wearing socks, and having that weird kind of divot with their socks. And, these geckos that would make sounds that would sound like cap and like this insanely loud karaoke machine that was like the new I just have to remind you that this town just got electricity 5 years ago before I arrived. So their new gadget was the karaoke machine or like the loudspeaker. And so you just hear these super drunk Lao women singing terrible, like whiny kind of karaoke songs. And I'm just reading this now, like I don't remember, now I'm remembering this, but just the sound of grinding chilies in a mortar and pestle because everything there was made with chilies. I woke up every day not only to the sound of the chickens, but we woke up to the sound of, in French you call it les cracheurs, which is people who spit. Cracher is to spit. And so half the time I was also speaking French because the guy was French, so we were like, in between French and English. So I have some, a lot of terms here that are in French and English and some Lao. And then just hearing the sound of the motorboats or, it was when I first started listening to Bonobo, and Chet Baker and, I don't know. So now like just kind of looking at this brings up whole new memories.
Yeah, I'm sure. Wow. That's so cool. And so it sounded like you were saying this was the end. You knew that this was the end of your trip.
Yeah. I knew that this was the end of my experience in Laos.
Right. Okay.
I had finally decided that after 6 weeks, I was in between this feeling of being a tourist and a local. And it's like a deeply unsettling feeling because you don't feel like you belong in either bucket.
Right.
And it just felt like it was my time to leave. And I had also been in contact with a doctor in India to study at Ayurveda. And it just felt like the right time to leave. So as it was coming to a close, I really felt compelled to capture my memories in something other than a photograph or words. And now I really use that in my journaling today. In kind of just grounding out and taking almost like a temperature check and going through all the senses, and then I'll start writing.
So you use it as sort of a prompt almost.
Yeah.
Could you walk me through sort of how like a journaling session would go for you?
Sure. So this was last month.
Even if you want, like if it's a personal one or whatever, if you could just kind of give the like feeling of what the container is that you follow or the pattern.
I think how it's kind of manifested now is more of a form of mindfulness than anything else. I think sometimes our journals can be caught up, or I'll just speak for myself. A lot of my journal was caught up in really extreme emotions. And I would resort to journaling when I was really elated or really upset or really feeling really stuck or sticky feet or indecisive. And I wanted to try to change my relationship with journaling to something that I can incorporate more on a daily basis that was also incorporated into my morning routine, which is kind of like my time to, for lack of better term, like access my higher self, sit down at my kitchen table, something that I could always rely on as a form of routine. I always had a pair of slippers. And I always, made myself a cup of coffee or had a coffee or tea somewhere and just sat down with myself for at least a few minutes and just took everything in.
So this routine started while you were traveling.
Yeah.
Your current routine morphed from or originated in the travel.
My morning routine shifted a lot after I left New York and started traveling because...
But you did have one before you were
Yes.
traveling. Okay.
Yeah, I had started to create a morning routine, at least of making breakfast in the morning for myself and sitting at my kitchen table. But it wasn't mindful. It was like, okay, I think the mindful part was cooking breakfast, but then I would watch CNN or like watch the news, and I wasn't really sitting with myself. And I think that helped me when I was in New York, but I wanted to take it a step further and make it something a bit more intimate for me and something that was more comforting and personal. So when I was traveling and I lost my sense of home, I just kept repeating that home is where your slippers are. And so most people travel with, zip out pants that turn into shorts. And I was like, I want to travel with my favorite pair of jeans. And I always wanted to travel with a pair of slippers. And that was kind of my way to feel like I was at home no matter where I was in this planet. So I think that's where it started. And then incorporating the senses just seemed like a natural inclusion into that to help me just kind of ground out more, discard whatever it was that I was thinking about, and just focus on the present moment. So yeah, that's kind of how, it is. It definitely serves now almost as a prompt to stay away from just like the extreme emotions and just get centered with whatever it is that I'm feeling right now outside of what's going on in my head. And it's still fairly new for me to use it in this way. But I'm really enjoying how much my journaling is changing as a result of it, as it almost like clears the cobwebs so that I can just focus on whatever it is that's popping up after that prompt.
Well, I already sidetracked you a little bit from getting into it, but part of me wants to mention something about how it sounds like you have a lot of self-awareness already going into this trip. I mean, it would be really easy to tell the story as like this big trip was like this huge shift, but it sounds like a lot of stuff was already going on for you around like self-awareness, like just that whole idea of like making your slippers like this sort of symbolic thing that gives you comfort and stuff. That takes a lot of self-awareness. I mean, how old were you when you went on this trip?
31.
Okay.
Yeah.
Because, it seems like I know a lot of people who wouldn't necessarily think in that way. So anyways, it's interesting to notice that part of me wants to just say it's because you've been journaling and that's why you're more self-aware.
Yeah.
That would be confirmation bias on my part, though.
I'm not sure if I want this to be in the podcast, but I'll say it anyway.
Yeah, we can pause right now.
No, it's okay. When I looked back, I've been journaling since I was really little. And like maybe like 9 or 10. And it was like a really interesting experience. Once in a while I'll go back and read some of them, and most of it is writing. It's not as much like beautiful drawings or anything. And I had this desire the other day to write a letter to myself of when I was 10, because I don't know, there was something that I'm still working on that it was really centered around probably things that you would typically think a young girl would be focused on. I was talking a lot about soccer and boys and my weight. I had a really difficult relationship with my weight growing up. And there was a lot in my journal up through college around my dating life, kind of like that typical Dear Diary perspective. And I think at a certain point when I started traveling, journaling came back to me, because I think while I was working in corporate, I didn't have a lot of time to journal. And I was just so happy that the subject changed. I mean, yes, there was still grieving in there and talking about, you know, a love interest or something here and there, but it was so much more about what I was going through that had nothing to do with my weight or athletics or all those things that really were governing the subject of conversation in my journals before. And I just felt this desire to want to write to myself back then and just kind of self-soothe or like comfort her. Because there was definitely like an impulse to burn it. But it's a part of my story, and I enjoy that my journal now talks about so much more than that, because I'm spending that time, or I've spent a lot of time with myself on all the other things. And yeah, it's really interesting to see how you evolve over the course of your journaling. And how easy it is to get stuck in thinking that your journal is for writing about your relationship woes or your, you know, your negative thoughts about yourself or the things that you don't want to tell other people. I think that was the outlet for my journal before. And now it's just changed so much where it's about, my self-awareness evolving, or how I want to help people heal through my story. So coming up with these little snippets like home is where your slippers are, or don't let a faulty chapter fuck up your whole book. You know, just sharing my experience with people, or finding a way to share my experience, has been like so empowering, that, you know, to see how my journaling has changed.
Wow. That's really cool. Okay, let's dive into some of the more specific stuff. If you have any parts or just kind of a general. This is recent here?
Yeah.
Stuff?
Well, I wanted, let's see. Because I was journaling about when I first started talking about the senses. Or are you just looking for...
Just anything about your process, like kind of, if like a walkthrough of, I sit down to journal and I do this and I do that, or if you have any particular entries that you want to read.
I picked some. Let me think.
That's okay if not, but like just to give an idea of sort of, because we've been talking a lot about this like awesome sort of trajectory and some of the bigger picture stuff, and I think it would just be cool to add to the conversation some of the more like particular, or what I sometimes call like tactical, like I use this type of pen and blah blah blah, you know, or like how you set up, like just walking through, like now that journaling is part of your morning routine still, what you said.
I guess I'll talk about that now, how it's
sure
evolved.
And if you want to include like where it fits into your morning routine or whatever, that would be cool.
I'll talk about my process, or I guess I'll talk about my morning routine first.
Okay.
So usually in the mornings, so in the evenings, I'll turn off my phone at least like a half an hour to an hour before I go to sleep. And I no longer sleep with my phone in my room, which I used to do, as many of us do, as our alarm clock. I purchased an alarm clock just so I could keep my phone out of my bedroom. And now I think of my bedroom as more of like my sacred space to just be with myself and sleep and rest. So in the morning, on an ideal morning routine day, I don't turn my phone on for the first at least hour. I get up really early, anywhere from like 5:30 to 6:30. And then there's something just really grounding for me about making coffee in the morning. And I always kind of inoculate it with some sort of spice. So in the routine now is like a little bit of cinnamon and cardamom. And I've been mixing it with chicory root. So immediately in that morning, I'm like, you're doing something good for yourself. Not just by being mindful, but by like adding these spices that are going to help with your digestion and like, have a really clear morning. And then I'll, usually still have my pajamas on, and I always have my slippers on, and I'll sit at my kitchen table and kind of look out over my window, which just overlooks a bunch of redwoods and
Cool.
other homes in the area. And I usually just pick up a book and we'll read like a chapter of whatever it is. And I'm, as you say, like, I like to do a lot of different things at one time. So I'm probably reading like 6 or 7 books at once. If you want to know a few of them, I'm cherishing Braiding Sweetgrass. So I'm just going through that really slowly. I'm reading A Path with Heart by Jack Kornfeld. Tending the Wild by Kat Anderson. Yeah, so there's a bunch. And then I always have like my Ayurveda textbook because once in a while I'll like want to read up on something specific relating to Ayurveda. And then now I've been journaling, and so
after reading, then you go, so you're drinking your coffee while you're sitting looking outside.
Yeah, and then I'll read a couple pages or a chapter of a book.
You're still drinking your coffee.
Yeah, probably it's done by then.
Oh, really? Okay.
And then I'll move on to, now I've been moving on after the coffee. I've been making coffee in a macchinetta ever since I got back from Italy, which is like that small percolator that goes on the stove.
Oh, it's like kind of like an espresso. Yeah, like, okay.
It kind of percolates up through the top.
Yeah.
So it's really good at infusing any sort of spices that you put into it.
Oh, cool.
So I have a shorter coffee these days, and so that leaves room for me to finish my coffee while I'm still doing my routine and make an herbal tea. And a lot of my herbs are either local or ones that I've harvested or foraged for myself. And yeah, I'll sit at my table and read, and then I'll also journal. And I have to admit that I don't do this every day. It's that's why you call it a practice, right? It's not always something that you get to, or there's like an abridged version, because after that I'll do yoga before I have breakfast. But this has just been really helpful in the last month, just to kind of stop and say, okay, like, what is sound telling me right now? So, this morning it was like the faint whirl of cars driving by River Road, at least 4 or 5 different bird calls, almost like a tennis match of sound. And then moved on to sight. Chimney steam from the neighbors next door. The smoke always seems a bit ominous. Maybe it's because I know there's some sort of shady dealing going on there. A faint crest of blue sky at the crack in light where the clouds separate. Layers of fog separating the ridgeline like forest bleachers. Various trees, each at their own phase of shedding leaves, of changing color. Some golden yellow, some green pine with frosted tips, some dark burgundy like leather. Touch. My textured mug in my left hand. Slightly unctuous texture in my coffee because I decided to use coconut milk instead of milk due to my congestion. A bit of stiffness on my neck and body aches. The bench feels a bit harder today. The light is creeping through more now, almost as if nature is rewarding me for being present. My mind feels quieter now as I use my senses to tune in. Smell. Can't smell much from this cold and flu. I bring the coffee mug up to my nose and inhale. Although I know there's coconut milk, cinnamon, and cardamom, I only smell heat. Faint smoke smell from the neighbors next door and the fire from my cast iron stove last night. Just like that, the light is now gone, leaving a faint hue of blue. There's always this tiny bird that perches on the highest point in the tree at 12 o'clock through my window. This is all I could draw before he flew down to a lower branch. Taste. Bitterness from the coffee. I feel like I can almost taste the crisp air outside my window. Like biting a cloud and leaving your mouth full of condensation. Cloud cotton candy. I notice how much more creative I feel in this space. What is beyond the senses? Is it okay to indulge in the senses and activities that promote sattvic behavior? I love this contrast of golden yellow leaves and sky blue. I imagine it as an outfit, a blue jumper and golden hat and boots. I feel calmer now. I'm trusting more. I'm not sure why I fight this feeling. As my therapist says, productivity is patriarchal.
Wow, that's really cool. I like that. Thanks for sharing that.
Yeah.
And that just seems like such a great, I mean, it's kind of awesome how you've discovered this sort of practice or prompt, and you mentioned the word mindfulness before, and it just does seem like such a perfect way to drop into mindfulness around your senses. And what a good way to do that, because I think by writing it forces you to really spread it out and give it attention, because it's one thing to sit there and try to like think it or say it, or like it's almost like a gratitude practice in a way. And it feels like by doing that, I mean, that's probably like 15 minutes of writing at least, would you say? Or how long do you think?
Yeah. And I started thinking to myself as I was doing this, okay, well, when you have only a few minutes to write, you can just write whatever sense is popping up the most for you right now, and not feeling pressured to like have to Rolodex through all of them.
Right. That would be patriarchal.
Yeah, I have to also mention that the reason also why I started bringing this back into my journaling is sensory experiences has been really top of mind for me lately, ever since I got back from India this past March. I did a panchakarma, which is like the Ayurvedic detoxification procedure that lasts for 3 weeks. And, it's interesting the things that just kind of light up in your consciousness where you're like, why am I thinking about this so much? But there's a line in Chataka Samhita, which is the ancient Indian Ayurvedic textbook. And it states that disease is caused by misuse of the sense organs. And I wrote a brief post about this a few months ago. But, at first glance, you think, okay, disease and sense organs. Okay, if I go through hearing, okay, don't go to a concert that's too loud and stand right next to the speaker. Or taste, don't eat moldy food. And then I don't know, when you're left with zero activity during this detox procedure, you end up just kind of thinking about these things and you're like, this has to mean so much more, but it's seriously just one small line. Granted, it's translated from Sanskrit, so it's super simple, but I don't know, one day I just realized, wow, there's so much more to this than like that first definition. There's such a deeper layer. And that's why during the detox procedure, you're not supposed to have any unpleasant conversations. You're not supposed to look into bright light. You're not even supposed to read anything, because you're really cutting yourself off from like any sensory experiences to avoid anything further from penetrating your inner world and causing any further disease as you're like cleansing out your body and your mind. So I realized, holy shit, this is so much more complicated. It's the people we choose to hang out with. It's our physical environment, the way we choose to set up our physical environment. It's the kinds of conversations we're choosing to have and the words that we're speaking. Ayurveda always says to be very discerning and careful with your words. So that just opened up this whole other realm for me of how I can prevent quote unquote disease in my life is by being more protective of my sense organs, but also honing them a bit more. And the journaling has really helped me do that.
Wow, cool. This is so awesome. I mean, I'm definitely going to steal some ideas from you. I hope that's okay.
Sure.
It feels like the prompt of describing a little bit about each of the 5 senses. I've used some things like that in nature connection, like hikes or workshops, tracking workshops, where try to get people to like do like sensory meditation, or even with kids programs, nature programs for kids. But I never thought of it as like a journal prompt, and I think that's super powerful. So I'm collecting like lists of different journaling prompts, and that just seems like a really therapeutic one. So, and really powerful in other ways. So that's really cool. And so maybe to sort of start wrapping this conversation up, I would love to hear like what you're most excited about in your journaling practice moving forward, or how you see, because you also mentioned that you do some coaching and stuff too. Do you ever, like, moving forward, or as you look at the future, like, how do you see journaling playing a role, or not? I mean, maybe you're done.
No, I think writing and journaling for me is just really therapeutic, and I think I've just become more patient with keeping my story to myself as I'm still kind of writing it.
Yeah.
And I'm hoping one day, like, my journey or my experiences will somehow turn into a book that I want to share. I've had that thought for many, many months, and since I basically got back from my trip. So, finding a way to share this, because I think it's valuable information for people going through it. Like, I think there's a lot of books being written once they've kind of come out the other side.
Yeah.
But there's something really valuable and vulnerable about sharing what it's like to be really going through it at the time that you're going through it, not writing from or journaling from the perspective of I'm through it now and I'm going to talk about it in hindsight. Yeah. And so I think there's something really valuable about going back and learning about yourself, and for me, figuring out, is there information worth sharing to people based on my journaling practice and my findings from my intuition journey. I think it will always be a part of my life, and I'm excited to see about where the Five Senses project, like, how it manifests, because I have a lot of ideas around creating it into a bigger wellness project of how to take optimal care of ourselves by really using the senses, or really tuning into the senses. Yeah. So I'll definitely be journaling about that as I go through that process.
Cool. Well, that feels like a really eloquent way to wrap things up. And I totally have really, I really believe that with your, like, energy and focus and motivation, and plus, like, some pretty awesome ideas, that something's going to be born out of this project. So really glad that I got to talk to you about it.
Yeah, thanks, Marley.
Cool. Awesome. Yay.
Yay, we did it.
Well, I hope you got as much out of that conversation as I did. And if you're interested in these types of interviews, or know of anybody who has an interesting journaling practice, please reply in the comments below and I will contact them. If you like this video, please thumbs up and consider subscribing to my channel. Bye!